Today, we are strapping in for what is perhaps the most uncomfortable kind of discovery, because we're diving deep into a machine that has become synonymous with high-stakes interrogation, national security, and just raw, stomach-churning anxiety.
The polygraph, the infamous lie detector.
It occupies a truly strange and, contradictory space in our culture, especially here in the U.S.
How so?
Well, it's an institution, a mandated checkpoint for huge swaths of the federal workforce. Yet it is almost universally rejected by the very scientific bodies tasked with verifying its efficacy.
And that is the absolute core tension we're tackling in this deep dive. We have sources covering the entire spectrum, from the polygraph's, frankly, flimsy scientific foundation stretching back a century.
Right up to its current controversial use inside today's federal agencies, and even, the development of next-generation brain scanning alternatives.
So our mission today is clear. To understand this century-old machine that was invented to catch liars, but fundamentally is scientifically flawed.
And we really need to figure out the profound paradox of why this method, which major scientific bodies flat out reject, is still so heavily utilized by U.S. law enforcement and federal agencies.
While police and courts across large parts of Europe and the rest of the world refuse to use it at all, it's a huge divergence.
It is. And before we unpack the history and the controversy, we have to ground ourselves in the mechanism itself. We need to clarify exactly what the polygraph is measuring and, crucially, what it is not measuring.
Okay, so first things first, it's not detecting deception itself, correct?
Precisely. That's the #1 misconception. It is not a direct detector of the state of lying.
So what is it doing?
It's detecting 4 specific physiological changes that occur within the human body. These are changes to heart rate, blood pressure, respiration, your breathing rate, and perspiration.
Because sweat.
That's measured through changes in the skin's electrical conductance. It has a technical name.
The galvanic skin response, or GSR.
Exactly. And all 4 of these metrics, heart, breath, pressure, and sweat, are entirely indirect indicators of stress or anxiety. The whole system is governed by a remarkable but, let's say, unruly part of our biology, the autonomic nervous system, or ANS.
The ANS is essentially our body's automatic response system, the fight-or-flight mechanism.
That's it. The ANS has 2 main branches. You have the sympathetic nervous system, which drives that stress response, the fight or flight, which increases heart rate, constricts blood vessels, raises blood pressure, and activates sweat glands.
And the other branch?
The parasympathetic nervous system. That's the rest and digest mode that calms things down. The polygraph relies entirely on that sympathetic branch working overtime.
So if you're anxious, whether from a true threat of being caught in a lie or just fear of the test itself, the sympathetic system surges and the machine picks that up.
That's the shaky inference, the assumption that the measured anxiety is uniquely induced by deception. That's the weak link where all the scientific problems begin.
So, the modern machine measures stress in 4 ways, all governed by the ANS. But this idea, this impulse to find an objective truth teller, that's not new. This goes back centuries.
Oh, it's ancient. Humanity has always searched for some kind of objective physical tell to separate the innocent from the guilty, usually through methods that involve, high levels of stress or pain.
Like what?
If you look back to the Middle Ages, for example, they used what were essentially trial-by-ordeal deception tests, sometimes involving things like holding a red-hot iron or plunging a hand into boiling water.
And the underlying belief there, which is just completely flawed, was what?
The belief was that divine providence, or simple physical purity, meant an innocent person would be harmed less severely or heal faster than a guilty person. It was based on a moral premise, not science.
So it was great at inducing stress.
Terribly effective at that, but objectively worthless for detecting lies. They really just show this enduring hunger for an objective truth test.
The move toward actual scientific attempts, which sought measurable, quantifiable responses, that started much later, around the turn of the 20th century.
Yes. The earliest scientific attempts began focusing on those physical changes we now know are governed by the ANS. Cesare Lombroso, the famous Italian criminologist, was one of the first to try this systematically.
When was this?
In 1895. He was experimenting in police cases using a device called a hydrosphygmograph to measure changes in blood pressure. He believed emotional stress related to guilt would cause a measurable change.
And his work was followed up by others, I imagine.
It was. In 1904, the Italian psychologist Vittorio Benussi advanced the research, using devices to measure changes in breathing patterns, specifically the inhalation to exhalation ratio. These were, critical foundational steps.
So they were proving that measurable physiological responses do correlate with emotional states.
Exactly. even if they couldn't definitively prove the source of the emotion was deception.
But the prototype for the modern machine, the one that really brought those measures together and became the lie detector, came out of a combination of academia and police work right here in California.
That's right. The polygraph itself, in its combined form, was invented in 1921 by John Augustus Larson.
Fascinating figure.
He really was a medical student at the University of California, Berkeley, but also a police officer with the Berkeley Police Department. He just combined Lombroso's blood pressure measurements and Benuzzi's respiration measurements into one device and started using it in police work.
And that's the moment it moves from a lab curiosity to an actual tool in criminal justice.
Yes, and like any great invention, it needed a few key upgrades to really take hold and become the iconic image we recognize today.
And that's where Leonard Keeler comes in.
Larson's protege. Keeler was instrumental. He took Larson's huge stationary device and made it portable, a huge step for field use. And, crucially, he added the measurement for perspiration.
The galvanic skin response.
In 1939. And that combination of heart rate, blood pressure, respiration, and GSR became the prototype for the modern polygraph.
And that prototype didn't just stay with local police departments.
No, it didn't. The Keeler polygraph was eventually purchased and adopted by the Federal Bureau of Investigation, the FBI. And that institutional purchase cemented the polygraph's role not just in solving crimes, but in U.S. governmental and security work for the next 80 years.
Despite its scientific shortcomings.
Despite everything.
Okay, so we have this historical progression from an ancient ordeal to a machine measuring 4 physiological indicators. But this whole thing relies on a really deep theoretical assumption, a chain of inferences that scientists have basically torn apart. You call this the flawed theory of construct validity.
Yeah.
Can you unpack what construct validity means here and why the polygraph just fails it?
Sure. Scientific validity, or construct validity in this context, just means that a test reliably measures the theoretical concept it claims to measure.
So if a test says it measures intelligence, it has to actually measure intelligence.
Exactly. For the polygraph, the theoretical concept or construct is deception. For the test to be valid, the entire process rests on this specific, very fragile chain of inferences that has to hold true every single time.
And what does that chain look like?
It assumes that deception leads to a unique, detectable, psychological state-like fear of being caught, which then reliably and uniquely produces a predictable physiological response, your heart pounds, which the instrument accurately measures, leading to a valid polygraph score.
If any link in that chain breaks,
The whole test is invalid.
that sounds like a lot of steps where things can go terribly wrong. I mean, especially that first step, deception leading to a unique psychological state, that seems highly questionable.
It is the weakest link. The theory offers 2 core models for why the polygraph might work, but each one contains a huge predictable flaw.
What's the first one?
The first is the conditioned response theory.
Which basically suggests that the social consequences of lying generate the fear we measure.
You've got it. The theory is that due to social conditioning, moral norms, and, punishment for getting caught, the act of lying is associated with a specific, emotionally charged and therefore measurable autonomic response. Lying creates guilt. Guilt creates fear. Fear makes your heart race and your palms sweat.
Seems logical on the surface, but what's the flaw?
The flaw is that those specific physiological responses are not exclusive to deception about the current crime. Innocent individuals can, and often do, show that exact same condition, fear or anger.
So give me an example.
Think about the person being tested who is a genuine victim of the crime, or even someone who has been falsely accused of something in the past and may be severely punished for it.
So when they get asked the relevant question about what's happening now, the stress they feel has nothing to do with whether they're lying right now.
Precisely. When they hear the critical question, did you take the money?
Right.
They can experience a massive autonomic response triggered by past trauma, shame, or just the overwhelming fear of being wrongly accused again.
But the machine just sees a spike.
It sees a huge spike, completely unrelated to deception about the current event, but it registers as a positive on the chart. That is the definition of a false positive. The machine measures stress, but it cannot read the source of the stress.
Okay, so that's a huge problem. What's the second theoretical model? The one that tries to measure knowledge instead of just general anxiety.
That is the arousal or orienting theory. This underpins a more sophisticated testing format called the Concealed Information Test, or CIT, sometimes called the Guilty Knowledge Test.
How does that work?
The hypothesis here is that detection occurs because specific, concealed information is highly evocative and triggers what's called an orienting response, a unique physiological what is it response that indicates recognition.
So if you show the subject 6 photos and one of them is the actual murder weapon, that's the one that will cause a noticeable reaction in the guilty person.
Exactly, because that piece of information holds greater salience or arousal value to the guilty party than to the innocent person who has never seen it before. The CIT format offers a stronger inference because it's trying to detect knowledge possession, not just the generalized stress of lying.
That does sound like a better scientific approach. And yet the scientific community still widely rejects the polygraph, even in a CIT format. Why?
Because even with the improved methodology of the CIT, the key logical and biological problem remains. The physiological responses, the heart rate, the brain activity, the behavioral reactions, they just don't reliably predict a single psychological state like deception.
They're multiply determined.
That's the term. It means many different cognitive processes, emotional states, and environmental factors can cause the exact same blood pressure spike or drop in skin resistance. Since we can't isolate the physiological response to only deception, the logical problem is still there. The foundation is shaky, no matter how you use the machine.
And when you move from the theory to look at the scientific community's actual assessment, the skepticism isn't just theoretical. It's a deep-seated consensus. The rejection of the polygraph by major professional bodies is, it's pretty shocking given how prominent it is.
It is a consensus of profound doubt, yes. I mean, consider the weight of these organizations. The American Psychological Association, the APA, states quite clearly that there is very little evidence that polygraph tests accurately detect lies.
And what about the National Research Council?
They issued a damning report in 2003. They concluded they found no evidence of effectiveness, especially in security screening contexts.
And this skepticism isn't new. It goes back decades.
It does. Even the U.S. Congress Office of Technology Assessment, way back in 1983, noted there was only limited scientific evidence and concluded that significant unacceptable error rates were not only possible but likely.
So when a technology is discussed in the same breath as pseudoscience by organizations like the APA,
It's a scathing indictment of its reliability.
which means we have to look at the practical cost of using an imperfect diagnostic tool. I mean, like any imperfect test, a medical test for a rare disease, a security test for espionage polygraphs are going to make mistakes. They're going to have false positives and false negatives.
That's the diagnostic dilemma. And policymakers using the polygraph, particularly in security screening, are constantly forced to make these truly unpleasant trade-offs.
Yeah.
A positive result, an individual judged deceptive, always includes a mixture of true threats and perfectly loyal, innocent employees. And the test has no way to tell them apart.
This brings us to a crucial concept that just fundamentally cripples the polygraph's use in national security, the base rate problem. This is a concept that, once you understand it, makes the U.S. government's continued reliance on the test seem, well, totally irrational.
This is so critical. The base rate problem explains why polygraphs are uniquely problematic when used for large-scale security screening. This is different from using them in a specific criminal investigation where you already highly suspect someone.
Because in national security, the thing you're looking for is incredibly rare.
Exactly. The specific violation, espionage, sabotage, it has an extremely low base rate.
So in a large federal agency, how rare are we talking?
Extraordinarily low. Maybe one spy or deeply disloyal person per 1,000 employees, maybe even lower. So that's a base rate of 0.1%.
So when you apply an imperfect test to a population where the thing you're looking for is almost non-existent, the test's own flaws just completely overwhelm its utility.
Yes, the sheer number of innocent people is the problem. The low frequency of actual guilt fundamentally skews the results because even a small error rate in the test becomes a huge absolute number of false positives.
Okay, walk us through the numbers.
Let's run them. And we can be wildly optimistic and say the polygraph is 90% accurate, which, again, most scientists would dispute in a screening context. So let's apply that 90% accurate test to 1,000 employees, only one of whom is actually a spy.
Okay, so you have one spy and 999 loyal employees.
Right. The 90% accurate test will probably catch that one guilty person.
Right.
But since the test is not perfect, it has a 10% false positive rate. So it falsely flags 10% of the innocent people as deceptive.
So You apply that 10% rate to the 999 innocent people.
Then you're going to get approximately 100 false positives.
Wait, so in this test of 1,000 people, you catch the one spy, but you also flag 100 perfectly loyal, innocent employees as deceptive.
That is the staggering reality of the base rate problem. When the machine flags someone as deceptive, that person is far, far more likely to be one of the 100 false positives than the single true positive.
Let me just say that again because it's the most crucial takeaway. If you fail a polygraph in a low base rate security screening, the probability that you are actually the threat is minuscule. You are innocent more than 199 times out of 200, even if the machine is 90% accurate.
That's the devastating implication. A positive result just indicates deception with a very small probability. And this forces federal agencies into an impossible choice.
Either you set the threshold so high you risk missing the one real spy.
The false negative problem. Or you set it low, and you have to investigate, sideline, and potentially ruin the careers of hundreds of loyal, valuable staff members for every single true threat you hope to identify.
The cost in money, in downtime, in just destroyed morale must be staggering.
It is. The accuracy is simply insufficient to justify it for general screening. It creates a toxic environment where loyalty and competence can be penalized by a test that is statistically designed to fail the innocent.
And the machine's reliability is already weak because of the theory, but then you add in external factors that can actively mess with the very physiological responses the machine is measuring.
Right, the physiological and pharmacological confounds. Remember, the polygraph relies entirely on the autonomic nervous system working properly. Anything that interferes with the ANS interferes with the results.
Such as chronic disease.
Yes. Diseases that cause dysautonomia, a malfunction of the ANS, can profoundly alter the readings. This includes things like Parkinson's disease or major conditions like heart failure, severe rheumatoid arthritis, or long-term diabetes.
How does something like diabetes affect the readings?
Many diabetic patients suffer from autonomic neuropathy, meaning the nerves controlling their involuntary functions are damaged. Their ability to activate their sympathetic system in response to stress is blunted or disorganized.
So an examiner looking for a clear spike in response to a question
Simply can't see one. The patient's underlying condition has muted the ANS output. This makes detection extremely difficult.
So if you're a deceptive spy but you have diabetic neuropathy, the machine is basically blind to your stress response.
Potentially, yes. And then there is the massive blind spot created by common medication. This is a huge factor.
Tell us about that. If I take common medications, I might be unintentionally insulating myself from the test.
Absolutely. Many commonly prescribed drugs directly modulate the ANS. Consider beta blockers. They are incredibly common, used to treat high blood pressure, but also anxiety, panic disorder, PTSD.
And they work by reducing heart rate and blood pressure responses to stress.
Exactly. So if an innocent, loyal employee takes a beta blocker for performance anxiety, they have a blunted response.
Yeah.
If a guilty spy takes one, they also have a blunted response. The test loses its differential power.
What else?
Tricyclic antidepressants, even some common antihistamines, act as anticholinergics. They block the activation of sweat glands. So if the subject isn't sweating in response to stress, one of the 4 key metrics just disappears entirely.
It creates this massive, easily exploitable vulnerability. Which brings us to a really fascinating and frankly unnerving aspect of this whole topic, intentionally manipulating the results, countermeasures.
The existence of effective countermeasures just utterly undermines the reliability of the polygraph in high-stakes environments because the people you're most worried about are often the most highly motivated and resourceful.
And the sources give the famous chilling example from Aldrich Ames, the notorious CIA officer and KGB mole who passed multiple polygraphs while spying for Russia.
Ames's advice, which he got from his Soviet handlers, was deceptively simple. He was told, get a good night's sleep and rest, and go into the test rested and relaxed. Be nice to the polygraph examiner, develop a rapport, and be cooperative.
So the key to defeating this high-stakes security test wasn't some spy gadget, it was being a good, well-rupted actor.
Essentially, yes. Ames later said that confidence was the decisive factor, and establishing that friendly rapport with the examiner makes them less vigilant, more likely to interpret ambiguous responses in a favorable way.
But beyond the psychology, there are specific mechanical countermeasures that target the way the test works.
Yes, this is where it gets really interesting. Polygraph testing relies on comparing responses. The examiner asks control questions, irrelevant questions designed to get a strong psychological response from everyone just to establish a baseline of nervousness.
And they compared the anxiety spike from those control questions to the spike from the relevant questions, like, did you pass classified material to a foreign power?
Correct. The hypothesis is that the relevant question will cause a much larger spike in the guilty person. The countermeasure is designed to neutralize that difference.
How?
The subject is taught to mentally record those control questions, and then when they hear one, they artificially increase their own physiological response. They inject noise into the system precisely when an innocent person would also be nervous.
How do they do that? Inject noise.
Simple, immediate, self-inflicted pain or intense mental effort. It could be biting your tongue, clenching your anal sphincter muscle hard, or pricking yourself with a tiny concealed tack or paperclip.
Something that causes a sudden spike in blood pressure and heart rate, but is invisible to the examiner.
Exactly. So if the subject artificially spikes their heart rate and GSR during the non-relevant control questions, the charts will show equally high stress responses for both the control and the relevant questions.
The differential response, the very thing the test is looking for, just disappears.
Completely. The examiner can't interpret a significant reaction because the response is flat across the board. The result is often inconclusive or a false negative, allowing the determined spy to walk away cleared because they cheated the comparison mechanism.
This brings us squarely to the great global divergence. Despite the overwhelming scientific consensus, the base rate problem, the countermeasures, the U.S. government is by far the biggest user of this technology in the world.
The institutional reliance is profound. The Department of Defense, the FBI, the CIA, they employ the polygraph extensively, particularly for security screenings, for access to sensitive compartmented information, or SCI clearances.
And we're talking of a massive scale here. This isn't just for a few high-profile cases.
No. As of 2013, the sources indicate roughly 70,000 job applicants or current employees are polygraphed annually by the federal government. It's just routine.
And this institutional reliance, coupled with the test's flaws, has naturally led to some major high-profile controversies.
Absolutely. The specific example that drew significant recent attention involved the FBI in 2025 regarding Director Kash Patel.
What happened there?
Reports and formal complaints circulated alleging that Patel waived required polygraph tests for senior staff, specifically political appointees like Dan Bongino, Rucker, and Yates, who then got SCI clearances.
Which means access to America's most sensitive secrets. So this reliance on waivers just bypassed the normal, highly invasive vetting process.
Precisely. The complaints allege violations of agency policy regarding disqualifying alerts or inconclusive results. The FBI spokesperson denied that any of the individuals failed the polygraphs, but they were notably vague about the exact results.
Which is an important distinction. An inconclusive result or deception indicated would normally stop you from getting clearance.
And the context here is crucial. These reports occurred amidst wider internal reports of career FBI staff being sidelined, where operational competence seemed to be sacrificed for what one former employee called ideological purity.
So the polygraph, or the decision to waive it, becomes a deeply political tool. It's a test of loyalty, not an objective measure of truth.
It highlights the true political power of the test. Even when it's scientifically invalid, the threat of the test can be used to manage the workforce and enforce perceived ideological alignment.
Okay, that's the administrative reality. Now let's look at the fascinating legal irony of the polygraph in the U.S. court system. We rely on it for government screening, but judges mostly won't allow it as evidence in a criminal trial.
It has a long and troubled history in U.S. courts, starting right at the beginning. In 1923, the landmark case of Fry v. United States involved excluding expert testimony based on the systolic blood pressure deception test. That was Larson's original device.
And Fry established the general acceptance standard, right?
It did. It required that novel scientific evidence must be generally accepted in its relevant scientific field to be admissible. And since the polygraph was new and contentious, it was excluded.
So the polygraph gave birth to the very legal standard that defines scientific evidence, and the test itself failed its own standard.
Exactly. Then, 70 years later, in 1993, the Supreme Court changed the rules with Daubert v. Merrill Dow Pharmaceuticals. The court replaced the Fry standard with the Daubert standard, which emphasized things like reliability, peer review, known error rates.
You would think that this new, more rigorous focus on scientific reliability would have opened the door for polygraph evidence.
That's the irony. It did the opposite. In United States v. Sheffer in 1998, the Supreme Court ruled definitively that there is simply no consensus that polygraph evidence is reliable.
So despite the shift in the legal standard from general acceptance to reliability, the conclusion is the same. Polygraph evidence is unreliable.
For that reason, polygraph results are rarely admitted in federal and most state courts. New Mexico is the notable exception.
And there are limits in the private sector, too.
Yes, the 1988 Employee Polygraph Protection Act generally prohibits most private employers from using lie detector tests for hiring or during employment.
Now, if we look across the Atlantic, the U.S. situation is a huge anomaly. The picture outside the U.S. is one of exclusion and firm legal rejection.
It's a completely different story. The Justice Ministry and Supreme Courts of both Germany and the Netherlands have explicitly rejected the use of polygraphs. They view them as invasive, unreliable, and potentially coercive.
And it's not just Western Europe?
Not at all. In Eastern Europe, the Polish Supreme Court declared in 2015 that polygraph use in interrogations is forbidden. It can only be used with consent, and only as an aid to guide interrogation, never as a substitute for actual evidence.
And this rejection extends to other large judicial systems as well.
That's India. In 2010, the Indian Supreme Court declared compulsory polygraph, brain mapping, and narcoanalysis tests illegal, citing the constitutional protection against self-incrimination. The overall international trend is clear. Judicial systems view these methods as unreliable and fundamentally incompatible with modern concepts of due process.
The scientific community knew about the flaws of the polygraph decades ago, which prompted the search for alternatives. So where has the quest for an objective truth detector gone since that box of wires?
Well, one of the early attempts to modernize was voice stress analysis, or VSA.
This is the technology that claims stress changes the sound of your voice.
That's the theory. VSA looks for microtremors and frequency shifts in the voice that are believed to be associated with stress. You don't need wires, just a recording.
How reliable did that prove to be?
Not very, unfortunately. Research has generally found that hit rates are close to chance levels, about 50-50. Like the polygraph, VSA is often categorized by skeptical researchers alongside pseudoscience.
So the search moved inward, aiming to image the brain directly.
That brought us to EEG, or electroencephalography, and the application known as brain fingerprinting. EEG measures the brain's electrical activity. Researchers look for event-related brain potentials, specifically waves like the P3B.
And how is this used?
It's applied in the concealed information test format. The idea is to detect if a subject recognizes specific crime-related information. The P3B brainwave might show a larger spike for an image that has specific relevance to the subject's knowledge of the crime.
So it's the guilty knowledge approach, but measured directly in the brain's electrical activity.
Exactly. It aims to discover the presence or absence of specific information, which is a stronger inference than just inferring lying. But researchers admit it is not yet an optimal tool for criminal investigation.
But the real cutting-edge frontier and the most fascinating leap in this entire history is moving to functional MRI, or fMRI.
fMRI is the ultimate shift in focus. It moves us entirely away from indirect measures like sweat and heart rate. Instead, fMRI measures the bold response, the blood oxygenation level dependent signal, which maps blood flow in real time. Simply put, it shows us which parts of the brain are lighting up during a task.
And the science suggests that the unique cognitive effort of lying activates different areas of the brain than telling the truth.
That's the hypothesis. Studies consistently suggest that deception correlates with greater activity in regions associated with cognitive control and executive function, like the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex and the anterior cingulate cortex.
The parts of the brain that handle conflict management and impulse control, it makes sense that lying suppressing the truth would light those up.
It does. And because fMRI looks at the central nervous system, it theoretically bypasses the weaknesses of the polygraph, like the problems with subjects who have diabetes or taking beta blockers.
Clinically, how does fMRI stack up against the old-school polygraph?
Initial data suggested it was significantly superior. Clinical trials using the concealed information test format found that fMRI experts were 24% more likely to discover concealed information than polygraph experts.
Okay, here is where it gets really interesting. We established that simple countermeasures can neuter the polygraph. Can they do the same to a multi-million-dollar high-tech brain scanner?
Yes. And this finding is the single biggest challenge to fMRI's reliability. Researchers designed studies to test the vulnerability of fMRI to simple, low-tech manipulation. They trained participants in simple, virtually imperceptible physical countermeasures.
What were these countermeasures?
The participants were instructed to perform a minimal motor movement, imperceptibly moving their left index finger, middle finger, and big toe just before responding to a question, but only when they were lying.
You're kidding me. We moved from wires to a multi-million-dollar brain scanner, and the whole system is defeated by remembering to wiggle your big toe.
It demonstrates the fragility of the entire deception detection enterprise. The result of introducing these tiny trained movements was devastating. In one experiment, the analysis was initially 100% effective in identifying the lie. Introducing the simple countermeasures caused the accuracy rate to plummet to only 30%.
A 70% failure rate. From wiggling a toe, that is a massive false negative rate.
It is. It suggests that a determined, well-coached individual could successfully conceal the truth 70% of the time, even against our most advanced technology.
And beyond the countermeasure threat, fMRI faces huge legal hurdles, mostly around whether what you find in a lab can be applied in a real courtroom.
The primary legal challenge is ecological validity. Current studies almost always rely on instructed falsehoods or mock crimes performed by young, healthy volunteers in a low-stakes lab environment.
They aren't using real defendants facing decades in prison.
Correct. Researchers freely admit they don't know if the bolder response is the same when a defendant's life or freedom is on the line. The emotional stakes are fundamentally different.
And the courts have been very clear about this.
Absolutely. In key cases like United States v. Semrau, courts have excluded fMRI expert testimony because the technology was found unreliable under the Daubert standard. They noted the lack of replication, non-standardized protocols, and the difficulty of even defining deception in a scientific, measurable way.
And there's a bigger, more philosophical problem too, isn't there? The whole mind-reading issue.
That falls under Federal Rule of Evidence 403. Courts worry tremendously about the prejudicial effect. The colorful images produced by powerful computers, as one ruling noted, may lead the jury to abdicate their sacred task as the traditional lie detector.
The fear is that the jury will see these authoritative brain scans and just defer to the machine, undermining the whole idea that the jury is the ultimate arbiter of credibility.
Exactly. The jury system is built on the idea that they judge truthfulness through demeanor, context, and motivation. Even if the tech were 99% accurate, the potential for replacing human judgment with a technological image is seen as a fundamental threat to the integrity of the process.
So let's synthesize this journey. We started with Cesare Lombroso measuring blood pressure in 1895, moved to Larson's 1921 polygraph measuring stress, and now we are using fMRI machines to map cognitive conflict in the brain. And yet
the central paradox remains absolute. We've moved from flawed mechanical devices to advanced neuroscience, but the fundamental problem of reliably correlating an internal psychological state deception with a measured physical or neural sign remains unsolved and, critically, vulnerable to simple, low-tech manipulation.
it's a remarkable persistence of an unsolved problem.
And the scientific evidence against the polygraph is overwhelming. It's statistically designed to punish the innocent in screening environments. Yet its institutional use, particularly by federal agencies, continues unabated. The reliance is based more on tradition and a perceived deterrent effect than actual reliability.
And that institutional reliance carries a significant non-technical cost. We saw this in the reports around the FBI controversy, the human cost of imposing this kind of pervasive, invasive surveillance.
From an HR and organizational loyalty perspective, the sources point out that this deep reliance on invasive tools like the polygraph risks eroding trust and morale in the workplace.
This runs completely contrary to everything we know about building high-performing teams, like what Google's Project Aristotle found about team effectiveness.
Absolutely. Project Aristotle showed that psychological safety, the confidence that a team member won't be punished for speaking up, is the single most vital factor. When an agency leans on flawed surveillance tools, you risk organizational effectiveness, you crush creativity, and you destroy loyalty.
It raises a profound question that connects the high-tech issues back to simple human nature. The polygraph and even fMRI is beatable by the confident, well-coached individual.
And that leads to our final provocative thought for you to consider. This whole discussion raises a vital question about the actual utility of these systems. Given the proven success of simple countermeasures, perhaps the polygraph is primarily effective at catching those who are genuinely guilty and also profoundly afraid, disorganized, or unsophisticated, the ones who don't know how to control their response.
So the truly dangerous ones, the confident ones, get through.
In this scenario, the greatest vulnerability these detection systems face is not a sophisticated psychological defense, but simply the determined, well-coached individual who has attained confidence. This suggests that the polygraph may be more effective as a highly expensive, statistically destructive filter for screening out the loyal but anxious than for reliably detecting the truly confident, resourceful threat.
Something to mull over. That's all for this deep dive.